In this video, we will show you how to build an API management center in WeWeb. An API management center allows you to put together all your API calls in one place where you get the data, create records, update them, delete them. Having all your API calls in one place is best practice when you want to create a web app that scales, because it enables you to update and debug API calls in one place and have those changes reflected wherever those calls are made in your web app. You don't have to build your API management center at the very beginning of a project. You could get the ball rolling by creating workflows locally wherever you need them in your app. But we do recommend that as soon as possible, you start refactoring your code so that you have global workflows in an API management center that is much more maintainable and scalable. For our use case, we need to be able to get a list of tickets, to update a ticket, or even create an entire new record. And we mapped out our endpoints in a Miro board. We have all of our endpoints where we get the user's tickets, a single ticket, we can update a ticket, or create a brand new one. In our backend, we have all the corresponding endpoints to get the user's tickets, create a new ticket, delete a ticket, edit a record. When creating an API management center in WeWeb, the first thing to understand is that if you are fetching data that can be filtered or paginated, you will need to create a collection. For any other API call to update, create, or delete a record, you will need to create a workflow. The first collection I'll want to create is my list of user tickets. So in the backend, I will copy the endpoint, and in WeWeb, I will create a collection, call it users tickets, and I will put it in a tickets folder so that all my API calls that get requests related to tickets are in the same folder. The source I will select as REST API. It is true that I'm working with the Xano backend and could use the native Xano integration, but for the purposes of this video, we wanted to stay unopinionated. So we'll show you how to build your API management center with the REST API plugin. Let's click continue. The method is get. I could choose a post, put, or patch. I don't need to in this case. And I could paste my endpoint like this. Except I'm going to do things a little bit differently because I anticipate that as my app evolves, perhaps the backend will be somewhere else. Perhaps the server will change. So if I look at my API group base URL in Xano, I see it's here, and then I have API path like /get users tickets. So this part here, I want to copy and in WeWeb place it in a variable. I'll call it base URL. It will be text, and the default value will be what I just copy pasted. Now back in my collection, instead of binding to the entire endpoint, I can bind to my base URL and concatenate with the path of the call, get user tickets. I can see the current value here, so I know that it matches. I got this correctly. Now, if I make this call, it's going to fail. Let me show you why. I will get a 4.1 error. Why? Because I am not authorized. I need to be authenticated. So if I want to fetch data from an endpoint that is protected by authentication in my backend, I need to make sure that I am logged in. So let's log myself as Jane. I will sign in. Now I have my access token. And in the collection, I can add my authorization header, which is bearer the access token. Now, this is specific to a Xano backend. A lot of backends use authorization headers with bearer tokens to authenticate. It may not be the case with your backend. You need to figure that out on your side. We can only recommend that you go through the documentation, the API documentation of the API you're working with. It will tell you what kind of authorization you need to get the data that is protected by authentication. In our case now, if we click continue, we should get the information that the 11 tickets related to this user. Note that in Xano, if we run and debug this request as Jane, we get an object with tickets. We get the same thing in WeWeb. So if we wanted to get just the array, we can just type in tickets. Now with the result key, we have those 11 items right away. So without the result key, the 11 items are nested inside tickets. I have the tickets object, and inside I have an array of objects. And if I add the result key, I just get the list of objects. Again, this will depend on the API that you are working with. So we recommend you have a look at their documentation and figure out in what form you want the data. In this case, there's no useful information associated with this tickets object. So we want to add the results key tickets so that we get straight to the point, straight to the list of items. However, if we start working with the list of paginated tickets, then we have a lot more information that we need. So let's create this, add a new collection called all tickets. It will be reserved for admins. Put it in the tickets folder, REST API. It's paginated. Once again, I will add my authorization headers. Important to have the space because there needs to be a space between the word bearer and the actual token. Now, if I click continue, I also get an error message because this time you need to be an admin to do this action. So instead of logging in as Jane, I will need to log out and log in as Bob. Because in my database, Bob is an admin, but Jane isn't. So Bob can access this endpoint, but not Jane. Okay, so now that I'm logged in as Bob, if I go back to my all tickets, I will click continue. And now I see that I still have my list of items, but I have a lot of interesting information here that I will need for pagination. So in this case, I don't want to add the result key items because then I would only have the items and I would no longer have collection metadata that might be helpful for me to paginate my collection. Now let's look at our API endpoint to fetch a single ticket. The URL path is /ticket/ curly brackets ticket underscore ID. The curly brackets signify that this ticket ID is meant to change. It's dynamic information. So if I run and debug in Xano, for example, I can fetch ticket ID 9 to get that information. Let's do the same in WeWeb. I will create a new collection and it will be ticket. In the folder ticket, REST API, there we go. my base URL plus ticket slash, let's say 9. For now, we're not going to make this dynamic. Let's add our authorization header. And click continue. Now we have the single item from our endpoint. Then further down the line, as we start building our project and creating a dynamic collection page to display data from a single ticket, we will be able to update the 9. Instead of having hard-coded 9, we can bind to a parameter from our collection page. For now, we'll keep it as is, and we'll just make sure that this collection is not preserved on navigation. This is because in our flow, if we look at our design, we will have the user on looking at a list of tickets, and then when they click on a ticket, they will go to another page with the information from that ticket. But then if they go back to the tickets, select another ticket, and go back to this ticket page, if we selected preserve on navigation, then during the API call, while we're waiting for the information from the new ticket that was selected, the data from the old ticket would still be displayed on the page. So it would make for a bad user experience. They would be blinking with the old data and then the new data when the API call was finished. So in this case, we do not want to preserve the collection on navigation. Now that we know how to create collections to fetch data that can be filtered or paginated, let's look at how to build global workflows to create, update, or delete items in our database. Let's start by creating a ticket. In this case, it is a post request and the path is /ticket. In WeWeb, instead of adding a collection, I will add a workflow. On execution, I want to create a ticket. I'll create a new ticket folder. Similar to collections, I want to make sure my workflows are nice and tidy. The action will be an API request. The method will be post, and the path will be my base URL plus I will need headers, authorization headers. And I will need fields. How many fields will I need? So when I create a new ticket, I have all of these potential inputs. So title, description, status, type, project link, video link, all of this. Let's create them. Title, description, status, type, project link, status, type, project link, video link, screenshots, and an explanation, and the user ID. Now, if I was making this API call on the page where the person is creating the ticket, I could bind to the variables from my form. But here, this is a global workflow that I will then execute on a page. So what values should I put here? Well, here I can bind to parameters from my workflow. So I will go back to my workflow here and add parameters. I will add the title, description, status, project link, video link, screenshots, needed soon, user ID. I need an explanation if it's needed soon. Let's see. Status type 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 3, 4, 5. That's it. So I don't need this one. And what's important is that the screenshots I will need to pass an array. I can see here it's an array of text. And if I go to my database, I see here it's a list. And needed soon is a Boolean. It's a true false answer. So I need to define this. I need to tell WeWeb what kind of data I will be sending. Now, if I go back to my API request, I can bind the field to my parameters and see for now everything is undefined, but we will test it in a second. Status type, and I need to be careful in case I didn't choose exactly the same order. Video, screenshots, did soon, explanation is here, and user ID is here. So now I can try with test data. What happens if I press test here? Well, it tells me that I was able to create a new ticket with ID 1002. If we go to Xano and we filter where ID is 1002, if we filter this, there we go, the new record we created. Let's now try to delete it. In our API endpoints, we will look for the delete endpoint. The path is /ticket ID. So let's create this now. Workflow, delete a ticket. The folder will be ticket, and here the only parameter we need is the ticket ID, which will be a number. On execution, we will make an API request. The verb will be delete, and we will use our base URL to look at ticket / plus the parameter of our workflow. For now, it's undefined, but we'll soon change that. I need the headers. And now, if I try with ticket ID 1002, I test this. It seems to have worked. Let's see here. If I refresh my Xano, yeah, I don't have any record with ID 1002 anymore. Learning how to create and execute a global workflow with parameters can take a little bit of time getting used to, but it will definitely save you time in the long run. As your app scales, as it grows in complexity, learning how to use global workflows is definitely worth the trouble. Let's have a look at a specific example on how to execute a global workflow locally. Here we have a page where the user can create a ticket. We have pre-filled this information with product feedback from Bob, and you can see that not all the fields are filled out, but when they are, for example, I have the email, I have the name of the user, I have the message and the title of the ticket. I can see that the checkbox is not checked. So here, if I check it, and here, if I don't, it's false. So on the form container, I can create a workflow where on submit, we execute our global workflow, the one that we named create a ticket. And because we added a bunch of parameters on our global workflow, we now are invited to bind the value of those parameters. So for the title of the ticket in the context of this page, the title is here, backup and versioning. The description, I believe we call the variable message. The status, we can hard code it. We can say new because all tickets that are created will have the status new. The type we can define as our variable selected type if we created one. The project link, even if the value is null, we can bind it. That way, whatever user fills out, we have that information. The video link, screenshots, the value of the file upload. Needed soon will be bound to the checkbox. User ID will be the current user's ID. And the explanation is the explanation for the urgency, which we created here. So now, if we go into preview mode and submit the form, we should be able to find our new ticket with ID 1003, backup and versioning, blah, 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 blah. We sent an empty field for project link, video link, screenshot links. Needed soon is unchecked. There's no explanation, and the user is correctly mapped. So now, because you are working with a global workflow, if you changed the create ticket workflow, if you added a parameter or deleted a parameter, it would affect all the times where you've executed that workflow in your app, which is extremely powerful because your app will evolve and you will want to update to change things. Using global workflows in an API management center allow you to do that seamlessly. That's it. That's how you build an API management center in WeWeb. If you know that your app is meant to scale, we highly recommend that you start building an API management center right at the start of your project, but you don't have to. Keep in mind, however, that if you catch yourself copy-pasting a workflow multiple times, it is a sign that you definitely want to create a global workflow.